Alright guys, I'm going to be covering the art of jetting a two-stroke today. Now this is going to be a long, super detailed video, so you may want to sit down, crack a cold one, and enjoy this video. Alright, let's get started. So let's start at the simplest of levels. What exactly is jetting? So jetting is changing out these little cylinder-shaped pieces that have a hole through them, just a tiny microscopic hole inside the carburetor here, to allow for more or less fuel to enter the engine. When you install a smaller jet, that lets less fuel into the engine, causing a leaner mixture. And on the other side, a bigger jet creates a richer mixture. So that's like the bare basics of jetting. And so what we're trying to achieve here is the optimal air to fuel ratio. And for most engines, that's going to be 14.6 to 1. So that's 1 gram of fuel and 14.6 grams of air to combine to make the perfect ratio. Now that number doesn't really matter, and we're not going to use it for jetting at all, more for just information purposes. So what happens when an engine isn't jetted correctly? If it's too rich, meaning too much fuel, it'll bog out like you whack the throttle and it'll just cough out, and then it won't rev out all the way, and then it'll cough and sputter throughout the RPM range too. And if it's too lean, it'll have a hanging idle, meaning you rev it up and it takes forever to idle back down. Lacks power, you may hear like a knocking noise to it. It feels like super zingy. It's kind of hard to describe that term. And then it'll run super hot too if it's really lean, and that's what leads to an engine seizure. So obviously both of these are kind of dangerous conditions to be in, especially being lean. That's what will destroy your top end and your crank. And then if you're too rich, you could cough out or bog out when you're riding, especially like on a face of a jump or whoop section or whatever it might be, and that obviously would not be a good thing to happen. Alright, now that you kind of understand what jetting is all about, let's talk about a few things before we actually start jetting. So say your bike's running like ass and you want to dive just right into jetting and figure this thing out. But there's a couple simple things you need to check over before you actually start pulling the carburetor apart and switching out jets. So first thing, pop in a new spark plug, make sure your air filter is clean. Those two things will make a big difference when it comes to jetting. If you have a plugged air filter, that will just throw everything for a loop. Same thing with a worn or really fouled out spark plug. Make sure you have good compression. You may want to test the compression before you actually start jetting to diagnose any issues with that. And then obviously make sure you have a clean carburetor. There's no plugged jets or plugged up vent hoses. That'll really mess things up too. If you just rebuilt your bike, make sure you break it in. That actually changes quite a bit. Once you have it broken in, it'll create more compression and change how much fuel the engine requires. Oh, and another big thing is float height. If you don't have the correct float height, that'll actually change how much fuel is available in that float bowl for the jets to suck out of. So if that's off, that'll make the whole jetting process kind of a nightmare. And one more thing, you want to make sure your bike is warmed up completely before you go out and test it to see if it's running properly. A cold bike runs way different than a warm bike does. Alright, enough talking. I'm going to pull the carburetor off of this bike, take it apart completely, show you the ins and outs of the carburetor, all the circuits, what affects how it runs down low, the mid-range, and then when you've got it pegged up top. So just going to cover all the basics before we actually start with the jetting process. Oh, and one more thing. Most bikes you can get to the carburetor or jet the carburetor if it's still on the bike. You can do it with this one. You just kind of twist the carburetor in there. But for this time, I'm just going to pull it completely off, show you guys the ins and outs like I was talking about earlier, and then we can start swapping out jets and all that. I'm going to see how fast I can pull the carburetor off of this bike. I'm hoping I can do it in under 2 minutes. Start the timer right now. So there's 4 components here to the carburetor that we're going to check out that affect the jetting and how the bike runs at a certain RPM. The first thing we're going to look at is the air screw on the back side of the carburetor. Don't mistake it for the idle screw, which is usually on the throttle slide and towards the center of the carburetor. And then number 2, we've got the needle on the throttle slide. And then inside the float bowl, we've got the main jet and the pilot jet. So the float bowl is what contains the fuel, and that's what the jets draw fuel from, and ultimately what provides fuel to the engine. All right, I'm gonna pull the float bowl off and show you guys the main jet, the pilot jet, and the floats as well. So here we've got the main jet, the pilot jet down here, and the floats. And then hanging on this little tab here on the floats is the float needle. And that's what controls the fuel flow into the float bowl. Earlier in the video, I was talking about float height and how important it is to have the correct float height. So the float height ultimately determines how much fuel is available in the float bowl for the jets to access. And if you don't have enough fuel in there, the bike's going to be starving for fuel, obviously. And if there's too much fuel in the float bowl, the bike's going to be bogging out, stumbling, and just not running too well. So to check your float height, we're going to let the floats extend all the way and then tilt the carburetor back and let them settle. So right there, they're settled, but they're not pushing in the float valve. So right there would be pushing in the float valve. You want it sitting just right up on top. And then you measure from the top of the float here to the float bowl gasket surface. And every bike is going to be different, so check your manual to see what the correct specification is. And to adjust the float height, you just bend this little tab that the float valve is hanging from. So when you bend it down, that increases the float height, and bending it up goes the opposite way. So definitely before you do any jetting, make sure you have the correct float height in your carburetor. There's a number of components here that affects how the bike runs throughout the RPM range. So we're going to start at the very bottom. So from idle to quarter throttle is the pilot jet, this one right here, and the air screw. So the air screw is what controls how much air is being delivered to the pilot jet, and this screw is how you tune in the pilot jet as well. So with the air screw, the farther you go in, the less air is going to the pilot jet, which creates a richer mixture, and then turning that screw out brings more air in and creates a leaner mixture. I'm going to talk about the air screw and the pilot jet later on in the video, but basically how you tune in the pilot jet with the air screw is when you're at a certain amount of turns out with the screw, that'll determine whether you should go up or down on the size of the pilot jet. And then next up, what controls from quarter throttle to 3/4 throttle is the needle here on the throttle slide. So you can adjust it up or down, and that changes how much fuel is being delivered throughout that throttle range. And there's actually 2 more pieces here that factor into jetting as well, but they're not that applicable to most situations, so I'm not really going to touch on it a whole lot. So you can swap out your throttle slide for something different with a different cutaway or a different shape, and that'll affect how much air is being let into the engine, which obviously affects jetting. And you can swap out your needle for something different too, one that's longer or shorter, or a different taper here on the end. But you're going to notice the biggest difference in adjusting your existing needle up or down. So the throttle slide just slides right into the carburetor right here. And when you twist the throttle, the slide goes up and down and allows the air and fuel mixture into the engine. So that needle goes down into the float bowl and through the main jet. So when you twist the throttle, that needle allows fuel from the main jet to enter the engine. And to move the needle up or down, you just reposition the clip on the needle in a different position. There's usually like 5 or 6 different slots on the needle. So when you move that clip down, that raises the needle and creates a richer mixture. And then when you raise that clip, that lowers the needle and creates a leaner mixture. And then last up, we've got the main jet. This jet makes the biggest difference of all your jetting changes and is going to be the most common jet you're going to swap out. So this one controls from half throttle to wide open throttle. To recap, we've got the air screw, and this is what you use to tune in the pilot jet. So the pilot jet and the air screw control from idle to quarter throttle. And then we've got the needle, which controls from quarter throttle to 3/4 throttle. And last up is the main jet, and this affects from half throttle to wide open throttle. So I'm going to get this carburetor back together, put it on the bike, and then we can start the tuning process. One last thing to discuss before we dive into jetting, and that is what affects jetting and what kind of things require you to rejet. And that would be weather, so like humidity, temperature, and then elevation's a big one too. Modifications, so if you did like intake or exhaust modifications to your bike, that'll require you to rejet. And then maintenance things too, like if you're low on compression or you got a dirty air filter or other things just aren't up to par, that will affect jetting too. And how temperature affects your jetting is when the air is warmer, it's less dense, and so you'll need to go down on your jet to compensate. So less air available means the requirement for less fuel. And then when you go up in elevation, the air is thinner, so same concept as temperature. Less air available requires you to go down on your jet. So for modifications, generally that requires you to go bigger on your jet. So if you have a more free-flowing intake or exhaust, that is more air traveling through, and that requires you to have more fuel as well. One thing that's super important with jetting and will save you a lot of frustration is just going step by step and only making one change at a time. Say if you change your needle position and your main jet at the same time and it negatively impacts how your bike runs, you're not gonna know which one affected that. So just keep it simple. So the first thing we're gonna tune in here is the air screw and the pilot jet. Now the pilot jet is going to be the one adjustment you're going to touch the least. Once you set it, you're pretty much good to go with that. And for the air screw, when you change elevation or the temperature or humidity changes, that is going to be the screw you're going to adjust. So how do you know if you have too lean or too rich of a pilot? If it's too lean, the idle will surge, meaning it'll go up and down, and then when you crack the throttle really quickly, it'll cut out or bog, and then it'll have trouble idling down as well. So you rev it up and it takes forever to idle back down. And then when you have a rich pilot jet, it'll sputter when you open the throttle, it'll foul out plugs, and it'll be really hard to start as well. So how I'm going to tune in the air screw and the pilot jet is by going 3 turns out on the air screw and then work my way back in half a turn at a time until the engine starts to stumble and the idle isn't very smooth. Then I'm going to go back out half a turn at a time until that idle smooths out and the throttle response is crisp. And wherever I end up with the air screw as far as turns out, that'll determine whether I need to go down or up on the pilot jet. And there's a few other methods out there for tuning in the air screw, such as adjusting the screw until the engine reaches its highest RPM. But I've always found that going by the sound of the bike, the throttle response, and the idle, that's always worked best for me. Now I'm going to fire up the bike, let it warm up, and then turn out this air screw to 3 turns out, and then work my way in from there. One, 1.5, 2, 2.5, and 3. So the bike died when I turned that screw all the way in. But now I'm at 3 turns out. I'm just going to start it back up and play with that screw some more. So you could hear right there, the throttle response is pretty crisp, but I'm going to start turning in the screw until it starts to bog out or starts to stumble when I turn the throttle. And so as you're turning in that air screw and you get to a really rich position, it'll sound like the choke is on. So it'll have like a sputtering or like a really choked up sound to it. And as you heard right there, it bogs out pretty good, and the idle just goes down really quick. So definitely too rich of a position. So I'm just going to work my way out a half a turn at a time until it cleans up, and then I'll count how many turns out I am on that screw. So right there seemed to be the sweet spot. I turned the screw out until the throttle response cleaned up and the idle smoothed out as well. And now I'm going to show you guys what a lean condition will sound like. I'm just going to continue turning that screw out and we'll see what happens. So right there, I'm about 3.5 turns out, and as you heard, it takes a while for the idle to go back down to normal, and the throttle response is like super zingy. Just has like a light feeling to it. The best way I could describe zingy is it just has like a different sound of the ding 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 to it. And once you play around with jetting enough and messing with the air screw, you'll be able to identify the difference between a normal tone of idle and a lean tone of idle. And actually, I forgot to check how many turns out I was earlier when I got it running crisp, so I'm going to take you through what it should sound like again. I'm going to start with the screw all the way in this time and back it out until I get it running really good again. So right there is the sweet spot again. Good throttle response and the idle is pretty smooth. See how many turns out I ended up at. So that is going to be a half, 1, 1.5, 2, and so 2.25. So I'm going to set it back to 2.25. That's a quarter, half, 1, 1.5, 2 right there. So that's 2.25. Ideally, you should have your air screw between 1 and 2.5 turns out. If you reach the best running condition under a turn out, that indicates that your pilot jet is too lean. So you have your screws so far in that you're barely letting any air in to make that good ratio. And then on the other side of things, if you have the screw more than 2.5 turns out to get the best running condition, that means your pilot jet is too rich. So you're letting a ton of air in to make that good ratio once again. So to recap, if you're less than 1 turn in, maybe bump your pilot up 1 size And then if you're more than 2.5 turns out, bump your pilot down a size. So the only times you really need to mess with the air screw is if you have a really warm or really cold day where you go up or down in elevation, or you add a modification to your bike. So say if there's a really warm day, you want to lean out the bike a little bit. So maybe go a turn out, or half a turn out I should say, see how it runs. And then if you go up in elevation, you'll need to lean it out there too. So once again, try going half a turn out, see how it responds, and go from there. And then if you add a modification such as a silencer or a pipe, you want to richen it up most of the time. I mean, usually the manufacturer, the pipe or silencer they'll tell you what you need to do there. But you may want to go, a half a turn or a turn in and see how the bike runs with that. So say you adjusted your air screw and you came to the conclusion that you're going to need to swap out a pilot jet. I'll show you how you can go about that without removing the carburetor from the bike. So first you're going to have to turn the fuel off and then loosen up the clamps on both sides of the carburetor. Now with the clamps loose, you can pivot it. That way you can get access to the nut on the bottom of the float bowl here. And on this bike, it's a little easier to remove the front sprocket cover. Just gives us a little more access to that float bowl nut. So this is a 17 millimeter, and as soon as I loosen this nut up, there is going to be some fuel that's going to come out. So have something on hand to catch it, or like a rag to soak it up. So to give you guys a little better perspective on how to get access to that pilot jet, I'm gonna lay the bike on its side. The jet you see right here is the main jet, super easy to get access to, but the pilot is up here in the front, tucked way up in there. And you're gonna have to fish around with a small flat blade screwdriver to get to it. So you wanna push up on the carburetor to get as straight of a shot with that screwdriver as possible. You can either tilt the bike back up and the pilot jet will fall out, or use a set of tweezers or needle nose pliers to get that pilot jet out of there. Then to get the pilot jet back in there, you just feed it in with a set of pliers or tweezers. Kind of push it up with a screwdriver right into the hole there. You want to get a straight shot with that screwdriver, that way you're not cross-threading those threads either. And it's pretty easy to get a false tighten here on the pilot jet. If you have the screwdriver cocked at an angle when you're tightening it, it'll feel like the pilot jet's tight, but it actually isn't. And then you go to ride it and it falls out. That's actually happened to me before, and it feels like the world's crashing down. Like the bike just bogs out terribly, and you wonder what the heck is going on. Then you can just put the float bowl cap back on, tighten it up, pivot the carburetor back into place. Definitely want to make sure you tighten up your air boot clamps as well. And then you can go test out that jet, see how it responds. Alright, so I've got the pilot jet and the air screw all tuned in, and next up for tuning is the needle position here in the throttle. So remember, this is the part that controls from quarter to 3/4 throttle. So to get to that needle, I'll have to pull the cap here off the carburetor. And so if you have a carburetor that has a screw-on cap, just a twist on cap, it's pretty easy to get to it with the carburetor still on the bike. But with this carburetor, there's 3 screws holding the cap on, and I've always found it easiest to just pull the whole subframe off like I had earlier. On this bike, it's also easier to remove the top shock bolt. That way we can pivot the shock out of the way and get access to the carburetor. It's only 1 extra bolt, and it makes life a lot easier. You just gotta lift up on the back wheel, kind of get some free play there, and then just slide out the bolt, and the shock will slide out of the frame. Slide the carburetor out of the intake manifold. That way I can get to these throttle cap screws here. And then once all those screws are out, the throttle slide just comes out of the carburetor. You gotta be really careful with that needle not to bend it too. So this is the needle I'm talking about adjusting. And with this carburetor, you just pull the spring, the tension off the spring, pinch the cable with your fingers like that, push it down inside the throttle slide, and it pops out. And now we need to get access to the clips here on the needle. So to get the needle out of the slide, there's a bolt that holds the needle into place. So right now I've got the clip in the middle position on the needle, and the bike seems to be running super good with it in that spot. But I'm gonna show you guys what it would sound like or how it would run with this needle richened all the way up. So I'm gonna move the clip to the bottom position here. So that's gonna raise the needle and richen the condition. And so I'm gonna put the bike back together and see how it runs. So that is the very bottom position here on the needle. And if I were to raise that clip to the top position, that would drop the needle within the slide and lean out the condition. So just like when I pulled it apart, I'm gonna have to compress the spring, grab the cable, kind of pinch it with my fingers. I've got a good amount of cable poking out there. And I'm just gonna slide it into the throttle slide, and you'll be able to feel it hook, and then you can release it. Sometimes this is a bit tricky to do when the cable is still on the bike. So I've got the cable hooked inside the slide. It's gonna release the spring. Make sure the cable is actually hooked to the slide, and then it just goes right back into the carburetor. If you guys are enjoying the videos and are learning a lot, I would really appreciate it if you supported the channel by shopping over at primemx.com. I've got some hats, t-shirts, stickers, and a few of the supplies I use throughout the videos over there as well. And another way you could support the channel is by using the Amazon and eBay affiliate links at the bottom of the description. So how this works is whenever you make a purchase through Amazon or eBay, through those links, I get a small commission, and it doesn't cost you anything extra. So just a simple way of supporting the channel and what I do. And so what you can do is set those links as a bookmark on your desktop or your mobile phone, and whenever you want to make a purchase on Amazon or eBay, you just click through that link, it'll be right there, and it makes it really simple. So I'd really appreciate it, guys. Thank you. Finding the correct needle position can be pretty tricky, and it's a lot easier to identify a rich condition rather than a lean condition. So what I would do, like I did here, is start in a really rich condition and work your way leaner until it clears up. So a rich condition is going to sound like the choke is on, it'll be sputtering, and it won't accelerate as quickly as it should. And so how you test the needle position is by warming up the bike and going through the gears, only accelerating until about half throttle. And if it starts to sputter out or cut out, that means the condition is too rich and you're going to have to bump that clip up a notch. So try to just go one notch at a time, or like with the jets, just go one size at a time. So I'm going to take this thing out and see how it runs with that clip in the richest position. So like I was saying, I'm just going to bring the bike up to about half throttle throughout the gears and see if it sputters out or coughs out at all. Any signs of a rich condition. Give that another shot here. right in the mid-range there, it's kind of cutting out, which is right where that needle would be affecting it. I'm just gonna make one more run down here and see if I can hear it a little more clearly. See it right there. I'll go back into first gear. Yeah, right there it's super rich, and that's where the needle will be affecting it most, right in the mid-range. So I'm gonna pull this thing back apart and move that clip position. Now I'm gonna put that clip back into the middle position since it ran really good within that spot before. So I'm gonna let the engine warm up, and then I'm gonna take it down the driveway once again, only going until about half throttle. And I'll show you the difference between a needle position that's way too rich and one that's just right. So like you heard before, about half throttle, it was super sputtery and it just didn't run very smooth, and all that should be cleaned up now. Sounds a little better. I think it needs to be cleared out just a little bit more. Definitely a lot smoother running, about half throttle. That is a lot better. Keep in mind, a two-stroke is never going to run perfectly smooth, just because they're, especially like a 125 like this, isn't really meant to be run in the mid-range, you know, all day. You're supposed to be more wide open with it, so it's never gonna run just super smooth like a four-stroke does. So you guys heard how the engine runs with that needle in the richest position, but if it's on the leaner side of things, the engine will sound kind of quiet and have like a dead feeling to it. And when you give it full throttle, it'll hesitate too. So you always want to be on the richer side of things with the needle, since it's kind of hard to identify whether you're rich or lean with that adjustment there. So like I explained earlier, you want to start with the needle in a richer position and then work your way leaner until it cleans up like I did here. And now for the main jet, I'm going to do something pretty similar to what I did with the needle adjustment. I'm going to start out really rich to the point where it's sputtering or it feels like the choke is on at high RPM. And then I'm going to lean it out until all that clears up. So once again, you always want to be on the richer side of things just to be safe. So right now the bike runs really good with the main jet where it's at, but I'm gonna bump it up a few sizes and show you how it would run in a really rich condition, and then go through how we would tune in the main jet from there. Just like any other jetting change, you wanna make sure you've got the bike warmed up before you go and test it out. So for the main jet, it affects from half to full throttle. So I'm just gonna go wide open and see how that fatter main jet affects it. I'm guessing it's gonna sputter at full RPM because that jet was a size or two bigger than what I had in there previously. Still needs to be cleared out a little bit. There was a little bit of sputter there though. you can definitely hear a little bit of sputter at the very top there, where it's like cuts out, it's not completely smooth, or it's not clearing out 100% of the way. So it ain't overly rich, it seems like, but definitely on the richer side of things. So I'm gonna pop in the old jet. I believe it was the 410, and I'll show you the difference it makes at full throttle there. After running the bike for just a couple minutes with that bigger main jet, we've got quite a bit of spooge coming out the silencer here. Definitely a bit rich. So swapping out the main jet is going to be very similar to the pilot jet. Got the bike leaned over on a stand. Just going to loosen up the carburetor, tilt it off to the side, remove that nut on the bottom of the float bowl here, and then I'll be able to get access to the main jet. All right, one last little test here. Should be running pretty crisp now. Sounds pretty good. Still a little bit of sputter up on top, but it sounds better than it did before. Let's give it another couple runs down the driveway. Oh yeah, that is so much better. Sounds really, really clean now. Yeah, that's perfect. Just where I wanted to see it at. Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I'm gonna call that good right there. If I really wanted to see exactly where I'm at for jetting, see how rich I am, I could do a chop test in the spark plug, and that would tell me everything I needed to know. So if you want to see how a chop test is done on a spark plug, just find the jetting or the spark plug video over on my channel. To recap, with that main jet, you want to start out really rich and then work your way leaner until it cleans out on top, and then just leave it right there. And it's always a great idea to do a spark plug chop test to see exactly where you're at with that main jet. So that pretty much wraps up the ins and outs of jetting a two-stroke carburetor. As you can tell, there's a lot of going by the sound and feel of the bike, and as you do it more and more, you'll get a really good gauge whether you're too rich, too lean, or just perfect with your setting. So it takes a lot of patience at first, and you only want to make one change at a time. So if you're messing with your pilot jet, don't make a main jet change or a needle position change at the same time. And don't make your changes too drastic either. Try to just keep it one size or like a quarter or half a turn at a time, and you'll really be able to dial it in. Another good resource for jetting specs is going to be Google or like a pipe or carburetor manufacturer. Say if you put an FMF pipe and silencer on your bike, go check out their website, or like Pro Circuit or Build, whoever it might be. They're going to have some recommended jetting specs on their website for you to start with, and then you can just kind of fine tune from there. And if you did more extensive mods like say a carburetor, a big bore, or a stroke or crank, do a Google search, and forums like Vital MX, Thumper Talk, or a few others will pop up, and they'll have a good baseline spec for you to start with, and then you can just kind of work from there too. So the only difference between jetting a two-stroke and a four-stroke is the air or the fuel screw. On a two-stroke, it's called an air screw because it controls how much air is being let into the pilot jet circuit. And then on the 4-stroke, it controls how much fuel is being let into that pilot jet circuit as well. So on a 2-stroke, when you turn that screw in, it lets less air into the circuit, creating a richer mixture. And then on a 4-stroke, it's the opposite. So you turn that screw in and it lets less fuel into the circuit, creating a leaner mixture. One thing I would recommend doing is checking the color of your spark plug throughout the jetting process and afterwards as well. So have a couple of fresh plugs on hand, pop them in, and keep an eye on them throughout. So I actually did a really detailed video on how to check the color of your plugs, and there's also a lot more you can read from a spark plug as well. And you can watch that video by clicking the circle right up here in the corner. Now, if you think jetting's a bunch of BS and you want a way around it, these electron carbs are a really good way to go. So basically how they work is they've got a metering rod inside of it, which is able to automatically determine how much fuel the engine needs based on airflow volume and temperature. So pretty much eliminates any need for jetting changes. So this is the carb I'll be using on my CR250 build, and I'll have a ton of videos coming out on the ins and outs of it, how to set it up, how it runs, and my overall impression of it. So lots of exciting content coming up soon. Now before I go, I need to pick the winners of the Works Connection sticker packs from the last video. So let's head over to the random comment picker page and find out who the winners are. So this is what I'm going to use to pick the winners here. It is a random comment generator. So I've got the URL punched in. Going to load up all the comments here. Should be quite a few in there. Probably over 1,000, I'm guessing. Oh yeah, 1227. Come down here, hit the start button, and that's going to pick a just random comment from that video. So the only requirement was you had to comment WC. So first winner is Moto Boys. He commented WC. I'm going to pick another one. Yep, didn't say WC. You are wrong. Reference your service manual for the proper spark plug readings. Sorry, buddy. Gonna pick another winner. Alright, Steven Holsinger says WC. So that's winner number 2. And then Aiden Zollner says, would love to see a jetting video. Doing that right now. WC, so that's winner number 3. Got 2 more. So keep in mind, if you see your name pop up here, you got to send me a message here on YouTube with your mailing address. All right, little dude is winner number 4. And the last one is JW Films. So all of you guys who won the stickers, send me a message here on YouTube. You just got to go over to the About page on my channel, hit the send message button, and shoot me your mailing address, and I'll get those sticker packs mailed out. All right, that is going to wrap up the video. Really hope you guys enjoyed it and learned a thing or two. This video took a ton of time and effort to create it, so I'd really appreciate it if you go hit that like button and subscribe to the channel as well. Thanks for watching, and keep it prime.